At 7:30 on the morning of September 18, 1944, Private First Class Arthur Jackson pressed his body against a jagged coral ridge on the island of Peleliu and watched Marine Corps history unravel in front of him. Japanese machine gun fire ripped across the open ground, stitching lines of dust through the coral as Marines tried to crawl forward and failed. To Jackson's left, a Marine raised his head for half a second. The machine gun caught him instantly. The man dropped without a sound. Arthur Jackson was 19 years old. He had been on Peleliu for 3 days, and so far, he had not fired a single shot in anger. The island was supposed to fall in 4 days. That was what Major General William Rupertus had told the 1st Marine Division before the landing. For days, the Marines would land, sweep across the island, capture the airfield, and move on. But Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had spent months preparing Peleliu for a different kind of war. Instead of suicidal banzai charges, the Japanese had built a fortress. Concrete pillboxes buried into coral ridges. Hidden caves connected by hundreds of yards of tunnels. Interlocking machine gun positions designed to kill anyone who moved across open ground. The island had become a maze of invisible guns, and every yard forward cost blood. On the first day alone, nearly 1,300 Marines were killed or wounded on the beaches. By the 3rd day, the 1st Marine Regiment had taken 70% casualties. 7 out of every 10 men who had landed were dead or wounded. Now the 7th Marines, Jackson's regiment, had been pushed into the southern peninsula. Their mission was brutally simple: break through the Japanese defenses, clear the bunkers, advance toward the airfield. But between the Marines and their objective stood a half-circle of reinforced concrete pillboxes, 12 of them, each one a miniature fortress. Japanese engineers had built them directly into the coral ridges. 3 feet of concrete, steel reinforcement, machine gun slits positioned so that every bunker covered the approaches of the others. Attack one pillbox, and 2 more would cut you down from the sides. The Marines had already tried everything. Grenades bounced harmlessly off the concrete. Rifle fire sparked against the walls and ricocheted into the coral. Several squads had attempted to rush the bunkers. Their bodies now lay scattered across the open ground in front of the firing slits. Jackson's platoon had advanced only 200 yards that morning before the entire left flank collapsed. 1 pillbox dominated the approach. Every movement brought fire. Every attempt to move forward ended with another Marine falling. The platoon was pinned. They could not advance. They could not withdraw. And the longer they stayed where they were, the more men would die. Normally the Marines would solve this problem with tanks or artillery, but Peleliu was not normal terrain. The coral ridges were too steep. The approaches too narrow. Tanks could not reach the bunker, and artillery could not hit the target without killing the Marines trapped in front of it, which meant the pillbox could only be destroyed one way. Someone had to run across open ground, 150 yards of exposed coral, directly into machine gun fire. The mathematics of that run were simple. A man under combat conditions could sprint about 15 yards per second. 150 yards meant roughly 10 seconds of exposure. Inside the pillbox sat at least 2 Japanese Type 92 machine guns. Each fired roughly 450 rounds per minute. In 10 seconds, 1 machine gun could put 75 bullets into the kill zone. 2 guns meant 150. No one could survive that. The officers knew it. The sergeants knew it. Arthur Jackson knew it. But Jackson also understood something else. Every minute his platoon stayed pinned down meant more Marines dying in place. If the flank didn't move soon, the entire attack would collapse. And sometimes the difference between life and death was not finding a perfect solution. Sometimes it was refusing to wait for one. Jackson pulled a fresh magazine from his pouch and locked it into his Browning automatic rifle. The bar weighed nearly 20 pounds. A heavy weapon to carry into a sprint. He stuffed as many grenades as he could into his pockets. Fragmentation, white phosphorus, anything that might work. Then he looked out across the coral. 150 yards, 35 Japanese soldiers, and 2 machine guns waiting for anyone foolish enough to move. Jackson did not ask permission. He did not look for orders. He simply stood up and ran. The moment he broke cover, the Japanese machine guns opened fire. The bar roared in his hands as he fired from the hip while sprinting. 30 caliber rounds tore across the bunker's firing slit. The bullets could not penetrate the concrete, but they could force the gunners to duck. And those seconds were everything. Bullets cracked past Jackson's head. Coral exploded beneath his boots. Dust and stones sprayed into the air. But he kept running. 100 yards. 80. 60. The bar magazine ran empty. Jackson dove behind a coral rock, slammed a new magazine into the rifle, and surged forward again. The Japanese gunners had recovered. Their fire intensified. 40 yards. 30. 20. At close range, the geometry of the pillbox began working against its defenders. The firing slit that allowed the Japanese to dominate the battlefield also limited their angle of fire. Jackson sprinted directly into the bunker's blind spot beside the main aperture. Inside the bunker, the Japanese could hear him, but they could not shoot him. Jackson pulled the pin on a white phosphorus grenade. The grenade ignited the moment it entered the firing slit. White phosphorus burns at nearly 5,000 degrees. The screams from inside the bunker began instantly. Japanese soldiers staggered out of the entrance with their uniforms burning. Jackson cut them down with the bar before they could raise their weapons. But the bunker still held more men, and the machine guns were still firing from secondary ports. Phosphorus alone would not finish the job. Jackson grabbed the demolition charge. 40 pounds of plastic explosive. 30-second fuse. One chance. He shoved the entire charge through the firing slit. Then he ran. Jackson dove into a shell crater and curled his body against the coral as the fuse burned down. 30 seconds. 20. 10. The explosion lifted the pillbox off its foundation. Concrete blocks, timber, and shattered metal blasted 60 feet into the air. The shockwave slammed into Jackson's crater. Fragments rained down across the battlefield. When the dust cleared, the bunker was gone. 35 Japanese soldiers were dead. Arthur Jackson slowly stood up. His ears rang. His hands shook. But he was alive. And 200 yards ahead, 11 more pillboxes were still firing. The logical thing would have been to return to his platoon. Report the success. Let someone else handle the next objective. Arthur Jackson reloaded his bar, checked his grenades, and started walking toward the next bunker. Jackson counted the explosions. Japanese grenades arced blindly over the bunker wall, each one landing somewhere behind him with a dull crack and a cloud of coral dust. 1, 2, 3. The pause came exactly where he expected it. Japanese Type 97 grenades had a 4-second fuse. The defenders inside the bunker could not see him. They were throwing blind, hoping luck would do what aim could not. Jackson moved during the silence between detonations. He slid forward the final few yards and pressed his back against the pillbox wall. The concrete radiated heat from the morning sun. Sweat ran into his eyes, stinging with salt and dust. His white phosphorus grenades were gone. Every one of them had been used on the first bunker. But he still had fragmentation grenades. And he still had his bar. More importantly, he had learned something. Japanese pillboxes were sealed concrete boxes. Inside them, machine guns burned through ammunition belts at incredible speed. Without ventilation, carbon monoxide would suffocate the defenders. So engineers added narrow shafts in the roof. 4 inches wide. Too small for a grenade, but not too small for a rifle barrel. Jackson climbed onto the roof. The concrete surface was rough, jagged with coral fragments embedded in the structure. He crawled until he found the ventilation opening. A dark circle cut into the roof. Jackson shoved the muzzle of his bar into the shaft and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared. 30 caliber rounds blasted downward into the bunker interior. Inside the confined space, the bullets ricocheted violently off concrete walls. The sound alone was deafening. Japanese soldiers inside had nowhere to hide. Jackson emptied the entire magazine straight down the shaft. 20 rounds. He slammed another magazine into the rifle and fired again. Another 20. When he dropped off the roof, the bunker was silent. 2 pillboxes destroyed. 10 remaining. The third and fourth bunkers stood close together. They were positioned exactly the way Japanese defensive doctrine required, mutually supporting. Each covered the approach to the other. Attack one, and the second would cut you down. Jackson studied the terrain. The 2 bunkers faced southwest toward the marine lines. Their firing slits covered a wide arc across open ground. But between them, there was something interesting. A narrow corridor of safety, barely 8 feet wide. A strip of coral where neither bunker could angle its weapons. It was a gap so narrow that most Marines would never risk it. Jackson sprinted straight through it. For a moment, he was perfectly centered between the 2 bunkers. If he drifted even a step to either side, machine gun fire would shred him instantly. He didn't drift. He ran like a man walking a tightrope. The defenders inside the bunkers realized what he was doing too late. Jackson reached the third bunker first. He jammed the bar into the firing slit and held the trigger down. The weapon roared until the magazine ran empty. He pulled a fragmentation grenade from his belt, yanked the pin, and shoved it through the aperture. The explosion shook the bunker. Without waiting to confirm the result, Jackson pivoted and ran to the fourth pillbox. The defenders were still reacting to the blast next door. Jackson repeated the process. Bar into the firing slit. Trigger down. Grenade through the opening. Another explosion. When the dust settled, both bunkers had fallen silent. For pillboxes destroyed. Roughly 55 Japanese soldiers dead. And Arthur Jackson had been fighting for less than 20 minutes. His situation was deteriorating. His bar had jammed twice from overheating. The barrel glowed with heat. Even through the wooden foregrip, the weapon burned his hands. His grenades were gone. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. A rational soldier would have stopped, fallen back, resupplied. But Jackson saw something through the smoke. Marines were moving. The gap he had torn in the defensive line was widening. Riflemen from his platoon were advancing across ground that had been impossible to cross an hour earlier. If he stopped now, the remaining bunkers would pin them down again. More Marines would die in front of those concrete walls. Jackson checked his remaining ammunition. 3 magazines. 60 rounds. 8 bunkers left. The math made no sense. Jackson moved anyway. The fifth pillbox was different. Larger than the others. Not as massive as the first bunker he destroyed, but still heavily built. And this one had something the others lacked. A rear entrance. Japanese engineers had learned from earlier battles. American troops often attacked bunkers from the flanks where firing slits could not reach. So engineers built escape tunnels. Hidden exits that allowed defenders to reposition or counterattack. Jackson did not know the tunnel existed. He approached the bunker the same way he had approached the others. Find the blind spot. Close the distance. Kill everyone inside. He pressed his back against the concrete wall, prepared to climb onto the roof. Behind him, the ground moved. A Japanese soldier emerged from the earth 5 yards away. The tunnel exit had been camouflaged with coral rocks and palm fronds. Jackson had walked right past it. The soldier lunged forward with a bayonet fixed to his Arisaka rifle. Jackson spun and fired. The bar thundered from his hip. 2 rounds struck the soldier square in the chest. The man fell backward into the tunnel entrance. But the gunfire had alerted the bunker defenders. Inside the concrete structure, boots hammered across the floor. Voices shouted. Jackson knew what was coming. He dropped to one knee and aimed directly into the tunnel. The narrow passage turned into a killing funnel. He pulled the trigger. The bar roared. Bullets ripped down the confined corridor. Anyone inside the tunnel had nowhere to go. Jackson burned through an entire magazine in seconds. He slammed another into the rifle and fired again. When the shooting stopped, 3 Japanese soldiers lay dead inside the passage. The bunker above them had gone silent. 5 pillboxes destroyed. 7 remained. But now the Japanese knew exactly where he was. And somewhere inside the island's tunnel network, officers were already giving orders. Meanwhile, Jackson crouched beside the bunker, breathing hard. To his right, Marines were advancing. Rifles cracked. Sergeants shouted commands. His assault had shattered the defensive line's rhythm. The Japanese were reacting now instead of controlling the battle. Jackson rose and moved again. The 6th pillbox stood on elevated ground. A coral ridge 15 feet higher than the surrounding terrain. Its defenders could see everything. There would be no sneaking up on this one. Jackson had 20 rounds left. He studied the ridge. Then movement appeared on his right. A Marine rifle squad had pushed through the breach. 6 men, led by a sergeant. The sergeant looked at the bunker, looked at Jackson crouched behind coral, and understood immediately. No orders were needed. He pointed, then charged. The Japanese gunners focused on the larger threat. Machine guns opened fire on the rifle squad. Jackson used the distraction. He climbed the ridge from its blind side, reached the roof, found the ventilation shaft. He shoved the bar down the opening. 20 rounds. Every bullet counted. When the rifle fell silent, so did the bunker. 6 pillboxes destroyed. Jackson stared at the empty weapon in his hands. 6 bunkers still remained. But now he was no longer fighting alone. The rifle squad that had helped Jackson destroy the 6th pillbox was reorganizing when the Japanese counterattack arrived. 40 soldiers emerged from a tunnel entrance 200 yards north. They advanced in disciplined formation, no screaming charge, no wild rush. Just steady infantry moving through the coral ridges with rifles ready. The Marines saw them first. The squad's bar gunner fired 3 rounds before his weapon jammed. Coral dust had clogged the mechanism. He dropped behind cover and struggled to clear the stoppage. Jackson stepped forward. He braced his bar against a coral outcrop and fired short, controlled bursts. 5 rounds. Pause. 5 rounds. He could not waste ammunition. Every bullet had to count. The Japanese formation scattered as soldiers dove behind rocks and coral ridges. Others continued advancing, rifles cracking. 3 Marines beside Jackson added their M1 Garens to the fight. 8-round clips snapped into place. Each shot was deliberate. Japanese soldiers fell. 10, 15, but more kept coming. Jackson's magazine ran empty. He loaded his last 20 rounds. The Marines were down to their final clips. Then the ground behind the Japanese erupted in explosions. 3 rifle platoons from the 7th Marines had pushed through the gaps Jackson had created. 40 Marines opened fire from the rear. The Japanese suddenly found themselves trapped between 2 American forces. Jackson and 3 Marines in front. 40 Marines behind. The crossfire was devastating. In less than 3 minutes the counterattack collapsed. 40 Japanese soldiers lay dead across the coral. The southern perimeter had lost its final reserve. 6 pillboxes remained. But now Jackson had ammunition. He had grenades. And he had 40 Marines ready to advance. The final strongpoint waited 300 yards ahead. 3 pillboxes arranged in a triangle, mutually supporting. 30 Japanese defenders. Jackson organized the assault in seconds. Hand signals. 3 teams. Each group would attack 1 bunker simultaneously. Jackson chose the center position, the largest bunker, the strongest. The Marines advanced. 60 yards of open ground. No cover. The Japanese opened fire halfway across. 2 Marines fell immediately. The others kept running. Speed was survival. Jackson reached the bunker wall first. He pulled the pin on a grenade, counted to 2, and threw it through the firing slit. The explosion silenced 1 machine gun. A second gun kept firing. Another grenade. Another blast. The bunker fell quiet. Jackson climbed onto the roof, found the ventilation shaft, and emptied his bar into the darkness below. The center pillbox was dead. To his left, another Marine team destroyed their bunker with a satchel charge. To his right, the 3rd group was pinned down. Jackson ran. Bullets snapped past him. One grazed his thigh. He kept moving. He reached the bunker's blind side, climbed to the roof, and dropped 2 grenades through the ventilation shaft. The explosions killed the defenders instantly. The triangle fortress collapsed in under 4 minutes. But Jackson was bleeding. Blood soaked his trousers. His leg weakened with every step. 3 pillboxes remained. The logical thing was to stop. Get medical help. Let other Marines finish the fight. Jackson reloaded his bar and kept walking. The 10th pillbox fell at 9:12. Jackson killed its defenders with grenades dropped through the ventilation shaft. The 11th fell at 9:21. A Marine named Henderson brought forward a satchel charge. Jackson placed it. The explosion destroyed the bunker and its 7 defenders. 1 pillbox remained. The 12th. It stood on a ridge overlooking the beach where the Marines had landed 3 days earlier. Its machine guns had killed at least 15 Americans. Jackson approached slowly. His wounded leg dragged through the coral dust. 3 Marines followed him. 1 carried grenades. 1 carried a flamethrower. 1 carried a bar with fresh ammunition. The Japanese opened fire at 100 yards. The Marine with the bar returned fire, forcing the gunners to duck. Jackson and the others kept moving. At 50 yards, the flamethrower operator stepped forward. He fired. A sheet of burning fuel slammed into the bunker opening. Flames poured inside the concrete chamber. Japanese soldiers stumbled out of the doorway, uniforms burning. Marine rifles cut them down instantly. The 12th pillbox fell silent. At 9:35, the southern peninsula of Peleliu was secure. Arthur Jackson had destroyed 12 fortified bunkers in just over 2 hours. More than 100 Japanese soldiers were dead. The breakthrough allowed the 7th Marines to advance. Jackson collapsed shortly afterward from blood loss. Medics evacuated him to the rear. For his actions that morning, Private First Class Arthur Jackson received the Medal of Honor. He was 19 years old. The M2 flamethrower had an effective range of about 40 yards. The Marine carrying it still needed to get closer. Jackson provided cover. He took the bar from the supporting Marine and fired controlled bursts toward the pillbox. The weapon kicked against his shoulder with each shot. His wounded leg buckled under him, forcing him down onto one knee, but he kept firing. The flamethrower operator reached effective range. He squeezed the trigger. A 3-second burst of burning fuel arced through the air and poured directly into the pillbox's firing slit. The screaming lasted less than 10 seconds. At 9:33, the 12th pillbox fell silent. Jackson collapsed against a coral boulder. His dungarees were soaked with blood. His hands shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. The bar rested across his lap, its barrel still hot from the final assault. In roughly 90 minutes, Private First Class Arthur Jackson had destroyed 12 Japanese pillboxes and killed more than 50 enemy soldiers. He had shattered the southern defensive line. He had opened the way for his platoon to advance. And he had changed the tactical situation across an entire sector of Peleliu. Navy corpsmen reached him within minutes. They cut away his blood-soaked trousers and treated the wound. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or artery. Jackson would keep his leg, and he would keep fighting. 3 days later, still limping, Jackson returned to combat. Word of the assault spread through the 7th Marines within hours. Officers who had watched from observation posts struggled to describe what they had seen. A single Marine attacking fortified positions that should have required an entire company. Pillboxes falling one after another. Japanese defenders killed in place. A defensive line collapsing under the actions of one man. The regimental commander forwarded a report to division headquarters. Division forwarded it to Corps Command. Soon the report reached the desk of Admiral Chester Nimitz. The Medal of Honor recommendation moved through the chain of command with unusual speed. On October 5, 1945, President Harry S. Truman stood in the White House. The war had ended only weeks earlier. Arthur Jackson, now 20 years old, stood at attention as the president placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The citation was read aloud. 12 pillboxes destroyed. 50 enemy soldiers killed. Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Jackson returned to Oregon after the ceremony. He had a medal. He had a limp that would never completely heal. And he carried memories that would follow him for the rest of his life. For decades, Arthur Jackson rarely spoke about Peleliu. He married, raised a family, and worked as a postal carrier in Portland. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who walked with a slight limp. Few realized the man delivering their mail had once stormed 12 pillboxes alone. Jackson remained in the military reserves, transferring to the U.S. Army Reserve and continuing to serve through the Cold War years. Eventually, he rose to the rank of captain. In 1961, he was stationed at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, serving as a security officer during rising Cold War tensions. During a confrontation with a Cuban worker suspected of espionage, Jackson shot the man in self-defense. The incident was controversial. Jackson requested a court-martial to clear his name, but the Marine Corps declined. He left active service the following year. The experience haunted him for years. On Peleliu, he had killed dozens and received the nation's highest honor. At Guantanamo, he had killed one man and received only silence. Over time, Jackson found a different purpose. He continued serving in the reserves until 1984, completing 40 years of military service. Later in life, he began speaking publicly about the war. He visited schools. He spoke to veterans groups. He talked about fear, courage, and the price of survival. In 2011, at age 86, Jackson visited the amphibious assault ship USS Peleliu. More than 1,000 sailors and Marines gathered in the hangar bay to hear him speak. Jackson told them about the landing, about the brutal coral ridges, about the men who never came home. He presented the ship's captain with his Medal of Honor flag, one of only 2 each recipient receives. The flag was placed in the ship's Hall of Heroes, beside photographs of the 8 Marines who earned the Medal of Honor on Peleliu. Jackson was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from that battle. On June 14, 2017, Arthur Jackson died in Boise, Idaho. He was 92 years old. Marine Corps body bearers carried his remains during full military honors at the Idaho State Veterans Cemetery. 73 years earlier, on a coral island in the Pacific, 50 Japanese soldiers had tried to stop a 19-year-old Marine. Every one of them died. The Marine lived another 7 decades, long enough to see the world remember what happened on Peleliu, and long enough to remind those who followed him that courage is not always loud, not always dramatic. Sometimes it is simply a young man standing up, running toward the impossible, and refusing to stop.